When studying evolution, we inevitably come up to the concept of natural selection. Many people forget that actually Alfred Russel Wallace, British naturalist, explorer, anthropologist, also biogeographist, and biologist in general, came up with the idea of natural selection or survival of the fittest, almost in the same time with Darwin. And he actually wrote numerous letters to both Charles Darwin and Charles Lyell regarding his observation of geographical patterns of species distribution, which today we refer to as biogeography, and this idea of the survival of the fittest or natural selection. So Wallace earned his living as a trading naturalist. New discoveries of different lands far away from Britain in particular and Western Europe, where most of the early naturalists and explorers were from, because they had the financial means to support these very expensive year-long world explorations, have discovered the hunger for displaying these different creatures that lived in faraway lands. So Wallace actually collected and shipped back to the British Natural History Museum specimens from the Amazonian jungles or Malaysia and other different tropical places that were fostering this large biodiversity that was completely unknown to the Europeans at the time. And his idea of the survival of the fittest and natural selection, it's based off another very interesting mind, Reverend Thomas Malthus, who also spent numerous years in tropical habitats. Malthus has observed human populations and wrote a very interesting essay on principle of populations that refer to overpopulations that can lead to competition on limited resources, which can lead to famine and wars and epidemics and so on. So Wallace based some of his ideas on Malthusian ideas. So please take a minute and read this paragraph. And once you have completed that, who would you think have wrote this piece of information? Because most people that read this paragraph will be convinced that was written by none other than Charles Darwin. It turns out that it's part of an essay on the principles of the origin of species written by Alfred Wallace. And he is credited with coining this idea of natural selection or survival by the fittest almost in the same time with Darwin. But speak about Darwin, he starts in theology and then moves on to medicine, and then upon graduation of college, he has this amazing opportunity to join an exploring cartography ship around the world. It wasn't supposed to be 5 years, it ended up to be 5 years. So he joins as a very young, recent college graduate, as the naturalist on board. And he notices species diversity first around South America and then Galapagos Islands and so on. I strongly recommend you look into Irving Stone's biographical novel regarding Charles Darwin's life. It's very interesting. I read it when I was in college, and not because it was recommended by a biology class, but because I actually fell in love with Irving Stone's biographical novels that I read before looking into Charles Darwin's biographical novel. So take a look at that when you have time and enjoy. So Charles Darwin, so upon his return, he has this mountain of information he gathered and shipped back and preserved. And he has numerous invitations to become a professor at Cambridge and other British universities. And even though he occasionally gave some lectures, he refuses because he realizes how much work he has ahead of himself. And he actually spent almost the rest of his life analyzing the material that he brought from the field. So this is young Darwin, Darwin living on the Beagle sheep that traveled around the world. So first, almost circumnavigated around the tip of South America and eventually got to the Galapagos Island, also known as the archipelago of Colón, which is the Spanish name of Columbus. And then it went from New Zealand to Australia and so on, back to the tip of Africa, a little bit back to South America, and then back to England. So most of us know this idea of Galapagos Islands being crucially important to the theory of natural selection, Darwinian theory of natural selection, and indeed it is, but it's not the only location that gave Darwin this mountain of unusual fossil and species diverse that were adapted to different habitats that he was used in his native country. So Galapagos Islands are about 18 to 21 islands. Some of them are much smaller, and they're located about 900 some kilometers or 560 miles away from Ecuador. And even though they are very close to equator, so they would be in very warm climate, because of the very cold waters that surround these archipelago of islands, they are actually relatively cold. And the first look, they don't look very impressive. But because they are far enough away from the mainland, so species that populated originally did not keep on going back to interbreed with species back on the mainland. And even though the islands are relatively close to each other, depending on the size of the species, those species did not interbreed across different islands. So they diverged and diversified and adapted to a very interesting endemic species. So endemic refers to species that only occur on a particular location, and they're fully adapted to those environmental conditions. So Darwin's theory of natural selection is better known for its study on finches on different islands on the Galapagos, but one very interesting adaptation that it's not found anywhere else would be, for example, marine iguanas. So as I said, the first look, they don't look like much. Luckily, Darwin had enough time and no cell phone and no other distractions, and he had the means to explore these volcanic origin archipelago of islands. So what he noticed, and obviously that's not just from the study, I'll be right back, of the study of the finches in the Galapagos Islands. So these birds are small enough that they won't keep on migrating between islands, so they will be adapted to whatever that island provides as food. And one particular adaptive trait would be to have a beak that it's going to be shaped according to its function, either of cracking seeds or collecting nectars, or sharp and thin to collect caterpillars, for example. So some of the basic theory of natural selection, as explained by Darwin, will include very important conditions that refer to the fact that given the right or amount of resources, every species tends to over-reproduce because not all offsprings will survive. So depending on their location on the trophic pyramid, species more closer to the bottom of the trophic pyramid, such as plants or other producers, would have much larger populations because you need a lot of their individuals to feed the coming consumers, such as the herbivores, and you need more herbivores that will feed the primary carnivores, and so on, all the way to the top of the pyramid. That's why it's a pyramid, has much more limited number of individuals because the resources are more limited. But back to the conditions of the basic evolutionary theory that Darwin left us more than 150 years ago now. The idea is that, again, every species has the ability to over-reproduce given unlimited resources of habitat and food and energy and so on. But the more the population increases, the more the resources, that if the resources are not unlimited, then those resources would be, the limitation of those resources would lead to competition. And intra-specific, so within the species competition, is usually more fierce than in between species or interspecific competition. So that means that since you're adapted to eat the same thing, you will compete for that particular resource more with your kind than with someone else. And competition would lead to survival of the best adapted. So that leads us to a few concepts that you definitely already read in your textbook, and if you didn't, could you please do so? So the concept of fitness. So fitness not only from an athletic perspective, but as the relative adaptation or adapted level to the particular habitat you're inhabiting at the time. And that leads us to the concept of adaptation. Adaptation or adaptive trait. That allows you and the rest of your population to survive that particular habitat better, giving you a higher relative fitness. So, for example, in humans, we have adapted to, so we are the survivors of previous humans that were exposed to particular disease. Or we are the survivors of humans that were adapted to survive, for example, feast and famine. So you would have a large crop, or during hunter-gathering times, you would come across this particular plant in fruit right now, and you would eat for a few weeks maybe, or the men would hunt and get this big mastodon, so the whole tribe will feed for maybe a month. But then after that, you're not so sure where the food comes from, maybe just much less than when you're feasting. So it turns out that we have adapted to that feast and famine fluctuations. And the people that have adapted to that had to survive levels of famine or reduced nutrition and that meant much slower metabolism. So, because today we have no cyclical feast and famine, we tend to overeat, or we eat because we don't know if is this going to be followed by a famine, and then we become overweight. And we owe all that to natural selection and what used to be a higher level of fitness. So the individuals that were adapted to survive those periods of famine were able to leave more offsprings. So the idea of natural selection is that the individuals that have a relative higher fitness because of their better adaptive traits would be outcompeting other individuals within the same species. And fitness refers not to just survival, but also to leaving your genes that gave you that heritable adaptive trait to your offsprings. So that means the next generation of that same species would have maybe a higher percentage of those genes that gave that particular adaptive trait. And in this way, leading to a shift in that particular population from one direction to another.